Good evening, Bruce. Thanks for being here with us. What made you shift your focus from finance to conservation?
Oh, well, let me say it didn't quite happen that way. I started out being interested in the issues of conservation and environment and also human rights. This is when I came to Washington in the early 80s. And I was trained as a lawyer, of course. And I began to realize, I attended meetings of the American Society for International Law, but I found them rather depressing because you had all these international treaties on the environment and human, which were not really enforced and not very effective. And of course, I noticed in Washington, D.C., right downtown, you had these two big collections of buildings for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And I began to notice that the role of the World Bank, in particular, in financing big investment projects that would affect the environment around the world was and also have social impacts, but was extremely important. And not just for the projects themselves or the amount of the investment, but because the World Bank was viewed as a leader in terms of setting policy, priorities, best practice and good practice in international development. So there was a huge multiplier effect. So I began to realize also that we live in an economic world, that in many countries already, over 30 or 35 years ago, the most important minister would be the finance minister rather than the foreign affairs or environment ministries in every country are relatively weak in influence. So I decided that if one wanted to have a leveraged impact on affecting the state of environmental conservation, also social rights, social equity in the world, you've got to follow the money and find a way somehow to push for the adoption of environmental and social standards for international lending, both public and private. And I started with the World Bank because it's kind of the Vatican of international finance. That's where it sets the policy and so on. So that was my way of thinking, and that kind of determined my career.
Okay. So what you would advise banks to do would be to loan funds to eco-friendly enterprises.
Well, yes. But let me share my experience with this because the world, I dealt starting in the early 2000s, you had the big international banks that do project finance in the world. Think of Barclays, think of J.P. Morgan Chase, think of Citigroup, the International Netherlands Group, and so on and so forth. These banks got together in the early 2000s themselves to talk about developing environmental and some social standards for their international project lending. There were 10 of them at first. And I was invited for discussions why they were doing this. And I knew it was serious when the people they had were not the corporate social responsibility people, were not the environmental people or the public relations. You had the heads of project finance. And for these people, at that time, project finance on Wall Street and other places, it was 40% of the profits. It was a go-go sector and that kind of thing. So I knew that was serious. And I found this to be most interesting. Since banks also are marketing their ability to analyze risk, all of a sudden they saw, well, if we're out ahead in presenting ourselves as experts in assessing the financial risk that can come from environmental and certain social issues, then that's a line of business. We can have a comparative advantage in lending since we're the people who can offer our risk assessment services and charge for it in this area. So they saw it as a positive area of what they could do. And this agreement, it's called the EQUATOR Principles. You can read like the EQUATOR, the principles. There's a website for it. Now there's, I think, something like 100 banks from many of the countries in the world, including major developing countries. The 4 biggest banks in Brazil are signatory to this agreement. One of the biggest banks in South Africa, several Chinese banks, and so on. And so it's a voluntary agreement, but still it shows that the banks too, the enlightened ones who want to have a competitive, mitigate risk and have a competitive edge, they now see that this is an area that they have to incorporate into their whole business model. Yeah.
So I think that's a step in the right direction where conservation is concerned.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your insights.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Was that